Well, compassionate and capable is a good combination. I have known some people who were very compassionate. You know, their hearts would break for people in their times of need or when they're in their times of trouble. But at the same time were capable, meaning they had no means of helping. They had no way that they could help the person in their situation. I've also known some people who were very capable. They had the means of helping someone in their time of need, but yet they weren't compassionate. They couldn't care less. Right? They were not willing to do anything to help. But when someone is both compassionate and capable, that's a good combination. Well, today we will see a few different events in the life of Elisha. Miracles that God performed through Elisha. And in each case, there were faithful followers of God, and God compassionately provides for them and helps them. God is both compassionate and capable. So we're going to start with chapter 4 and verse 1, starting with a faithful widow in dire straits. Chapter 4, verse 1 says, "Now the wife of one of the sons of the prophets cried to Elisha, 'Your servant, my husband, is dead, and you know that your servant feared the Lord, but the creditor has come to take my 2 children to be his slaves.'" So, here's what we know about this woman. Just from this, about this woman and her situation. There's 4 things. First of all, her husband has just died. So it's just her and her 2 sons. This means that because her husband has died, now her sons will now provide for her. In that culture, that's pretty much how it happened. And so the sons would then have to provide for her. The second thing we know about this woman is that her husband was in debt. That means now she is in a really bad spot because she's in debt and has no means of paying that debt. Now, we don't know how he got into debt, but it could be just something really simple, like they had a bad crop one year and didn't have enough and had to borrow. Or the man, we know he just died, maybe he got hurt, or maybe he was sick and was not able to work and had to borrow. Or maybe his animal got hurt or sick and they couldn't get all the harvest on it. Whatever the reason, he had to borrow. And so he is now in debt. The third thing we know about this situation is that the creditor, the guy who loaned them money, wants to be paid back. And he rightfully should be paid back, but he wants to be paid back. But in order to be paid back, he wants to take this lady's sons to be slaves to work off the debt. Now let me explain this. In that culture, sometimes as a last resort, when someone was poor and could not pay off their debts, they could sell themselves into slavery in order to work off the debt. In other words, they would work for a contracted amount of time. They would make an agreement, this is a contracted amount of time, and they would serve to pay what they owed. Now, the Mosaic law, the Old Testament law, allowed for this because it provided really poor people a way to continue living. Because otherwise, what would they do? They would just starve. And so they would have nothing. But the law, the Mosaic law, also put limitations on this. I mean, the maximum time they were to serve as a slave or as an indentured servant was 6 years. And they were to be treated well. In fact, the scripture says, remember, they're your brother, they're your relative. Okay, so they were to be treated well. But in this woman's situation here, if her sons were then taken by the creditor to work off the debt, she would be left alone with no one to support her. So she's in a bad spot. And the fourth thing we know about this woman is that she and her husband were faithful followers of God. Now, how do we know that? Well, from a couple things. First of all, when she cries out to Elisha, she says, you know, your servant feared the Lord, or your servant, her husband, feared Yahweh. So in Israelite society at this time, when many people did not fear the Lord, many people were in idolatry, to the society who was going downhill, we have this woman and her husband who do fear the Lord. So they are following God. And the other thing we know is that when she finds herself in this predicament, what does she do? She goes to Elisha. She goes to the prophet of Yahweh. And so she's looking to God for help. So she and her husband are faithful followers of God. Let's keep reading. Verse 2. It says, and Elisha said to her, what shall I do for you? Tell me what you have in the house. And she said, your servant has nothing in the house except a jar of oil. Then he said, go outside, borrow vessels from all your neighbors, empty vessels, and not too few. In other words, a lot. Then go in and shut the door behind yourselves and your sons and pour into all these vessels. And when one is full, set it aside. So she went from him and shut the door behind herself and her sons. And as she poured, they brought the vessels to her. When the vessels were full, she said to her son, bring me another vessel. And he said to her, there is not another. Then the oil stopped flowing. She came and told the man of God, Elisha, and he said, go sell the oil and pay your debts, and you and your sons can live on the rest. Now, remember last week we talked about Jehoram, and they went going up against Moab. Do you remember Elisha's response to Jehoram? When Jehoram came to him, Jehoram, the evil, idolatrous king of Israel? When Jehoram came, Elisha basically said, what are you doing here? Why are you coming to talk to me? Because he had no interest in God. So he was like, why would you be coming to talk to me? How was that response different than this one here? Totally different. You could say it's the opposite. Because he says, what can I do for you? See, in the first it was, go ask your false prophets for help. Here it's, what can I do for you? So we have the faithful follower of God coming to the prophet, and the prophet is there, and he says, what can I do for you? God is totally willing to help her. Then he asks what she has. In other words, what resources do you have? And she says, well, all I have is one little jar of olive oil. That's all. That's not very much. But this is going to be the basis of God's provision for her. He's going to take what she has and provide for her through it. So God tells her through Elisha, go and gather every container you can find that will hold oil. And so not just in your house, but go outside, go to your neighbors, borrow anything you can. Anything you can get your hands on that'll hold oil, get it. And bring it to your house. Then go into the privacy of your own home and shut the door behind you. In other words, this is not to be a spectacle. God is not putting on a show here. You know, sometimes God does great miracles, huge miracles that lots of people see. This is not to be that case. This is just a private thing that's going to happen because God is privately, simply compassionately providing for this lady. By the way, notice that even Elisha isn't present when this happens. She goes in away from Elisha and closes the door. Because who's doing this for her? God. God is doing this for her, not Elisha. But God, again, he's compassionately providing for this lady and for her sons in their time of need. And so the sons keep bringing containers. And as they bring these containers till they can't find any more, God just keeps multiplying the oil. So here's another container, and she's pouring it out, and the jar just never stops flowing. There's just more and more oil. It never runs out. And so they fill up the containers, and they keep putting it, and then until they fill up the very last container. And when they fill up the very last container, the miracle of the never-ending oil stops. It comes to an end. That supply ends. And then Elisha tells her, go out and sell all that oil. And it's enough to pay back the debt plus money to live on. In other words, God is being gracious to her and kind to her, and he gives her more than enough for than what she asked for. She's like, hey, I'm in trouble. And God gives more than enough. Enough to pay back the debt and to live on. But this is interesting. God doesn't just make the debt go away, or make oil appear, or make money appear. What's he do? He starts with what she already has and then uses that. You see, God is miraculously provides, but she had to do something. She had to step out and obey in faith. You see, if she didn't believe God or trust God and obediently take and gather up containers and start pouring that oil, what would have happened? Nothing. She had to step out in faith and obey God. And so God is compassionate and kind. He has a heart for the weak and the suffering and the downtrodden. And he's powerful enough to do anything. And he blesses and provides his faithful people. And when God, here's the thing, when God meets our needs, he also challenges us to grow in faith and obedience. See, he works in our lives in ways that cause us to act in faith-filled obedience. So the challenge for us when we read this is, so put your faith in God. Trust him and obey him. Do what he has told you to do. Live for him. Put your faith into action. And now we come to the next episode. A faithful lady who has everything but a son. Look at verse 8. One day, Elisha went to Shunem, where a wealthy woman lived, who urged him to eat some food. So whenever he passed that way, he would turn in there to eat. And she said to her husband, behold, now I know this is a holy man of God, so she knows he's a prophet, who is continually passing our way. Let us make a small room on the roof with walls and put there for him a bed, a table, a chair, and a lamp, so that whenever he comes to us, he can go in there. So first, we see this lady, and we're told that she urges Elisha to eat. So when Elisha comes to town, she recognizes that he's a prophet. And she urges him to eat. In other words, she's being hospitable, which in that culture was a godly thing to do. So she's being hospitable, and when he comes to town, she says, hey, come in here and eat. And she's wealthy. She has the means to help him. So she says, hey, come on in. And so he does. He starts eating with them. But then she wants to do even more. She's like, you know what? I want to honor the prophet. Let's make a room for him in our house. And houses those days, they had an upper floor. And so they set aside a little room and made it for him so that whenever he came into town, he could stay with them. So again, they're providing for him. But this lady is presented here as a godly woman who's seeking to honor God by honoring his prophet. Okay, let's keep reading. Verse 11. It says, one day he came there and he turned into the chamber and rested, and he rested there, and he said to Gehazi his servant, call this Shunammite. When he had called her, she stood before him, and he said to him, say now to her, see, you have taken all this trouble for us. What is to be done for you? Would you have a word spoken on your behalf to the king or to the commander of the army? She answered, I dwell among my people. Okay, so they make this room, and Elisha stays there, and he eats with them whenever he's in town, and he really appreciates it, and he wants to do something for her. And so he offers to help her. And as a prophet, Elisha, he had connections. And so he could talk to like the leaders on her behalf and kind of have them help her with any issues she might be having, any problems she might have. But she says, I dwell among my people, is a way of saying, hey, everything's fine. I don't got any problems. Everything's okay. So she has no needs like that. So, verse 14, and he said, what then shall be done for her? Gehazi answered, this is his assistant, Gehazi answered, well, she has no son, and her husband is old. He said, call her. And when he had called her, she stood in the doorway, and he said, at this season, about this time next year, you shall embrace a son. And she said, no, my lord, O man of God, do not lie to your servant. But the woman conceived, and she bore a son about that time the following spring, as Elisha had said to her. So Elisha talks to his assistant Gehazi, and he's like, well, what can we do for her? I appreciate that we really want to do something for her. What can we do for her? Well, Gehazi has an idea. He has noticed that she has no son and that her husband is old. And when he says that their husband is old, it most likely means that he's old enough that he's not going to have children, past childbearing years, and naturally anyway. And so, but here's the thing. In that time, in that culture, having a son, having children in general, but a son was very important because the son carried on the family line, and that was very important to them in that culture. And as we just saw in the previous episode, the son, when a father died, the sons cared for the mom, the widow. And so another thing is often when someone was childless in that culture, they were looked down upon. There was some shame that those people carried around. And part of that is because the thinking was, well, because we read the Old Testament covenant, the law, and God had promised to bless his people. So if someone wasn't having children, the thought was, well, God is not blessing them, therefore you must be doing something wrong. That wasn't always the case, as we've seen in many instances. But that was the thing. You must not be being faithful to God. And so there was some shame that people carried around. And here's another thing. As a Bible reader, when we read that someone doesn't have a child, where's your mind immediately go? I mean, if you're someone who's read the Bible, you immediately expect that God might give this person a child. It might provide a son, because we think of Abraham and Sarah, too old to have children, and they didn't have any. God miraculously gives them a son. We think of Hannah. We think of Zechariah and Elizabeth, who are John the Baptist's parents, but they had no kids till God promised they would have a son. See, so we think of all these people and others who all had their miracle babies. And so when we read this, we expect God's going to do something. Or he might anyway. So he tells Gehazi to go get this lady, and he tells her that she will have a son within the next year. But notice her response. She says, basically, please don't lie to me. In other words, this is just too amazing. This is too good to be true. So don't tell me this if it's not true. And so she's like, don't lie to me. But this shows that she really does want a son. She wants a child. And even with her wealth and her social standing, this is something, she still would have carried around that shame. She still carried around the sadness of not having a child. And it would have actually been cruel if he wasn't telling her the truth. But see, this was a problem that she and her husband, even with all their wealth, even with all their social standing, it was a problem they couldn't remedy by themselves. And so this was no joking matter. And she says, please don't lie to me. And that's obvious in her response, that there's a weight that she's been carrying around. But Elisha is telling her the truth, and she has a son just like he said. But let's read what happens. Verse 18. When the child had grown, he went out one day to his father among the reapers. And he said to his father, "Oh, my head, my head." The father said to his servant, "Carry him to his mother." And when he had lifted him and brought him to his mother, the child sat on her lap till noon, and then he died. So sometime later, this tragedy strikes. His dad's out in the field harvesting the crops. Son goes out with him, and suddenly the boy cries out in pain. His head hurts. Tells the servant to take him to the mom. He does, and the mom, she just holds him in her lap until eventually he dies. Verse 21. And she went up and laid him on the bed of the man of God and shut the door behind him and went out. Then she called to her husband and said, "Send me one of the servants and one of the donkeys that I may quickly go to the man of God and come back again." And he said, "Why will you go to him today? It is neither new moon nor Sabbath." She said, "All is well." So now she steps into action, okay? The boy, here's the thing. This boy was a gift from God. And she isn't willing to accept his death till she knows for certain that there's no hope. God had already performed one miracle in giving her the son. And now it seems that she's hoping for another. And so she lays the boy on Elisha's bed, and she shuts the door, and she doesn't tell anyone what's happened. She just keeps it quiet. Her husband is still working in the field, so she tells him she needs a servant and a donkey so she can go see Elisha and then come back. Now, this request surprises her husband because it's not a normal time for her to have gone to see the prophet. And he's like, "Why?" But her answer may suggest that he is, there was some concern in his voice, and maybe he's putting things together. The boy was her, but she just simply says, "All is well. It's okay." You see, I think she's waiting to see what God is going to do. She's not telling people, "Oh, he's dead." She's waiting to see what God is going to do. Let's keep reading verse 24. Then she saddled the donkey, and she said to her servant, "Urge the animal on. Do not slacken the pace for me unless I tell you." So she set out and came to the man of God at Mount Carmel. When the man of God saw her coming, he said to Gehazi, his servant, "Look, there's the Shunammite. Run at once to meet her and say to her, 'Is all well with you? Is all well with your husband? Is all well with the child?' And she answered, 'All is well.'" So she gets the donkey ready, and she tells the servant to go fast. You get the impression that normally he would take it easy to make sure she was comfortable. But she says, "Don't worry about that. Just move. We just need to get there quickly." She says, "I'll tell you if I need to slow down, but let's go." She gets close, and Elisha sees her coming, and he knows who she is, so he sends Gehazi out to her to meet her and to make sure everything's all right. And she gives that same evasive answer. "Everything's okay." You see, she doesn't want to talk to anyone about this except the prophet. I mean, the prophet Elisha is the one who had promised, or who God had promised, through whom God had promised she would have this son, so she wants to talk to him. Verse 27. And when she came to the mountain, to the man of God, she caught hold of his feet. And Gehazi came to push her away, but the man of God said, "Leave her alone, for she is in bitter distress, and the Lord has hidden it from me and has not told me." So as soon as she gets to Elisha, she gets down and grabs his feet. And this is an act of humble submission, but it also suggests that she has a request. But Elisha doesn't know what it is. This is interesting. See, God has not told him what has happened. God has not revealed the situation to him. And so it's a surprise to him. He doesn't know why she's come. In fact, just like her husband was surprised she was going to the prophet, he's surprised that she came. And she's like, "What's going on?" Well, Gehazi, he sees her grab his feet, and he tries to stop her because maybe he thinks this isn't not appropriate or whatever. But Elisha says, leave her alone. because he can tell she's really upset, but he doesn't know why. But she's held this all together till now. Everything's okay. But now when she's with the prophet grabbing his feet, she lets it all show. Verse 28. Then she said, did I ask my Lord for a son? Or did I ask you to give me a son? Did I not say, do not deceive me? He said to Gehazi, now he's figured it out. He said to Gehazi, tie up your garment and take my staff in your hand and go. If you meet anyone, do not greet him. And if anyone greets you, do not reply. And lay my staff on the face of the child. Then the mother of the child said, as the Lord lives and as you yourself live, I will not leave you. So he arose and followed her. So when she finally speaks, you can hear her great distress. And she reminds Elisha that she didn't ask for this son. This was just offered to her, promised to her. And at this time, and she says, and at the time, she had told him not to play with her emotions. Don't lie to me. And her words here express her pain. In fact, it's worse to have been given a son and then to lose him, have him taken away, than it would have been if she had just never been given a son at all. This is what her words are saying. But her words also tell Elisha what has happened, that something terrible has happened to the boy. And all of her action to this point implies that she believes Elisha can do something about it. You see, she's pouring out her heart in faith in God. So Elisha tells Gehazi, who is younger and therefore can run faster, he tells Gehazi, run to the boy. And there's several things he says. He says, tie up your garment. Well, the reason for that is because they wore long robes, so in order to run fast, you pick it up and you tie it up out of the way so you can go. In other words, hurry. And then he says, and don't greet anyone. Now, he's not trying to be rude here. He's just simply saying speed is of the utmost importance. Don't take time to talk. Focus on the task at hand. And then he tells him to lay my staff. He said, take my staff and lay it on the boy's face. Now, we don't know, it's unclear what exactly the point of this was, but it may be that Elisha was sending Gehazi with his staff to symbolize his authority, and that the boy might be healed when the staff is laid on him. But with all of that, the woman is still holding Elisha's feet, and she refuses to leave Elisha. Does it remind us of someone? Remember when Elijah was going away, and Elisha says, as the Lord lives and as you live, I will not leave you. The same words. You see, this woman is clinging to Elisha in faith in God. And so he goes with her to her house. Verse 31. Gehazi went on ahead and laid the staff on the face of the child, but there was no sound or sign of life. Therefore he returned to meet him and told him, the child has not awakened. When Elisha came into the house, he saw the child lying dead on his bed. So he went in and shut the door behind the two of them and prayed to the Lord. Then he went up and lay on the child, putting his mouth on his mouth, his eyes on his eyes, his hands on his hands, and he stretched himself upon him. The flesh of the child became warm. Then he got up again and walked once back and forth in the house and went up and stretched himself upon him. The child sneezed 7 times, and the child opened his eyes. So Gehazi lays the staff and nothing happens. He's dead. He goes back towards Elisha, meets him on the way, tells him what's happened. Elisha gets there, sees the boy dead, goes in and shuts the door, just like the previous miracle when with the woman with the oil. He goes in and shuts the door. In other words, again, this is not to be a spectacle. This is just, God's not putting on a show. He's just compassionately providing for the woman's need. And we're told that Elisha prays. He stretches himself out over the boy. He gets up and walks across the room and back, stretches himself out over the boy again, and the boy wakes up. Well, actually, he sneezes 7 times and then opens his eyes. But don't miss the key point here, because it's very easy to get caught up in all of the other little stuff. He stretched out, he walked, he stretched, he sneezed. It's very easy to get caught up in all of that. We need to catch the most important thing. What is the very first thing that Elisha does? He prays. Why? Because it's God who is reviving this boy. And only God can give life. Verse 36 says, Then he summoned Gehazi and said, Call the Shunammite. So he called her, and when she came to him, he said, Pick up your son. She came and fell at his feet, bowing to the ground. Then she picked up her son and went out. So she falls at Elisha's feet again, but this time it's not in distress, but in gratitude. And she takes her son. You see, God is compassionate and caring. God rewards and helps his faithful people. But he also allows hardship in our lives. And those hardships give us the opportunity to exercise faith and to seek God. The thing is that things may not always turn out with the happy ending like we see here. Things may not always turn out the way we want them to. But even in that, it gives us the continued opportunity to hold on to God, to trust him, to exercise faith, and to look, here's the thing, look to eternity, when everything will be right. When we will, no matter what happens here, we will have a happy ending. You see, this is our hope. Our hope is not in this world. Our hope is in eternity, when we will be with God forever. And there will be no crying, no pain, no death, no sorrow. We will have a happy ending. Well, now we come to the last episode, and it has 2 parts, but in both of them we see the faithful who need to eat. So verse 38 says, And Elisha came to Gilgal, where there was a famine in the land. And as the sons of the prophets were sitting before him, he said to his servant, Set on the large pot and boil stew for the sons of the prophets. One of them went out into the field to gather herbs and found a wild vine and gathered from it his lap full of wild gourds. And he came and cut them up into a pot of stew, not knowing what they were. And they poured out some of the stew, some for the men to eat. But when they were eating of the stew, they cried out, O man of God, there is death in the pot. And they could not eat it. He said, Then bring me flour. And he threw it into the pot and said, Pour some out for the men that they may eat. And there was no harm in the pot. So Elisha's leading this group of prophets, and they make some stew. And but before we get to that, talking about the stew, I want you to notice what it says in verse 38. It says, There was a famine in the land. Now, what does that make you think of? If you read the Old Testament, read the covenant, what does God say? God says, there's sin. God says, if you obey me, I will bless you. I'm going to send rain and your crops will grow. If you disobey me, I will curse you. I'm not going to send rain. Your crops won't grow. And it's meant to discipline them, to bring them back to God, to turn them back to him. So what's happening? Their crops aren't growing. They're not having rain. They're not being obedient or faithful to God. The bulk of the people, or much of Israel, is unfaithful. They're worshiping false gods, idols. And so, back to the stew. The servant doesn't know it, but he's gathered up some poisonous gourds. He cuts them up and puts them in the stew. And when they realize that it's poisonous, they tell Elisha. Now, remember, there's a famine going on, so there's not a lot of extra food, so you don't waste food. But here they just boiled up this entire pot of stew, and it's no good. And so Elisha basically throws some flour in the pot and says, now it's okay. It's safe. It's not poisonous anymore. You see, God made the stew edible and provided for his prophets, for his faithful people. Let's keep reading, verse 42. It says, a man came from Baal Shalishah, bringing the man of God, the prophet, bread of the first fruits, 20 loaves of barley and fresh ears of grain in his sack. And Elisha said, give to the men that they may eat. It's to the prophets, to this group of prophets. But his servant said, how can I set this before 100 men? So he repeated, give them to the men that they may eat. For thus says the Lord, they shall eat and have some left. So he set it before them, and they ate and had some left, according to the word of the Lord. Okay, so this man brought some bread from, did you catch this? The first fruits of his harvest. Now, again, if we remember the covenant, what is significant about the first fruits? Yeah, and so this ties in with the drought idea too. We've got things going on here, okay? We got people in Israel who are not being faithful to God, and we have somebody here who is bringing their first fruits to God. The first fruits were dedicated or devoted to God. And so they were to be brought to God as a gift, as an offering. But they were brought to God and they were given to the priests to support the priests, so the priests could eat as God's servants. But this godly, faithful man who's bringing his offering of first fruits doesn't take it to the priest, he brings it to Elisha instead. Why? Well, apparently, he doesn't want to bring this offering to the priests who are mixed up in Jeroboam's twisted religion, who are not being faithful to God. So what he does is he brings it to Elisha, who is truly faithful to God, who is truly God's servant. And so he brings this as an offering to God and gives it to the prophet. Well, the thing is there's not enough bread for all of the prophets there. The group of 100 men. But Elisha says, give it to the men. The servant, of course, hesitates and questions his order because he's like, there's not enough. He tells him again, give it to the men. But he adds, because God says there's going to be enough. And not only is there going to be enough, there's going to be leftovers. So that's exactly what happens. And so again, we have God providing for his faithful people. God is compassionate and capable. Now, I've got to add this. When we read this story, this event that happened in Elisha's life, doesn't it make you think of something else? Jesus. When Jesus fed the 5,000, Jesus fed the 4,000, he took a little bit of bread and multiplied it and fed the multitudes. Those people who were there, who Jesus fed, they knew their Bibles. What is our Old Testament? They knew the Bible. They most likely knew this event that took place. They should have recognized when Jesus multiplied the bread, they should have recognized in that God was working. They should have recognized the authority of God in Jesus' miracle. They should have recognized that someone greater than Elisha was there with them. Because Jesus' miracle was even greater. Okay, Elisha took, these small, I think it was 20 loaves of bread, and fed 100. Jesus took a smaller amount and fed thousands more. They should have recognized that someone even greater than Elisha was there with them. They should have recognized the coming of God's kingdom. But instead, most of them just had their hunger satisfied and later wanted more. But they were unmoved spiritually. Now, I don't say this to put them down. I'm saying this to point out that we need to recognize what God has done and what God is doing. We can see how he has worked in the past, what he has done, and we can see when God is working now in our lives. So recognize what God has done and what he is doing in our lives now. And I also say all this because I just want to praise Jesus. I say this to the praise of Jesus, the one who is far greater than any of the prophets, came into our world, laid down his life to save us, and rose from the dead to live forever as our Lord. Jesus did what only he could do, what only he alone was capable of. God has compassionately provided for us through Jesus. He has given us eternal life through his Son. He is compassionate and he is capable. When we saw these different episodes here from Elisha's life, each one of them made different specific points. But running through them all, we see that God is compassionate and capable. He is all-powerful and good. And he works on behalf of his faithful people. He doesn't always work the same way. Things don't always turn out the same way. But he cares for his own. And as believers in Jesus, we belong to God. We are the people of God. And God loves his people. So whatever your situation is, whatever you are going through right now, we're in a good place. We can be going through terrible, hurtful, or just bad situations, but we know we're still in a good place because we belong to God. And he loves us and he cares for us. And we have a hope and a future. God is compassionate and capable. So live a faith-filled life of obedience.